The ship screamed through the purple sky as fire consumed its wings and metal tore apart like paper in a storm. Jake Morrison fought with the controls, but nothing responded anymore, and the ground rushed up to meet him faster than his mind could process, and he knew this was going to hurt badly. The impact threw him forward against his restraints, and the world became a blur of pain and twisted metal and shattered glass, and then everything went silent except for the ringing in his ears. He hung upside down in his seat for a moment, before his shaking fingers found the release, and he dropped hard onto the crumpled ceiling and groaned as his ribs protested. Smoke filled the cockpit, and Jake crawled through the broken canopy and collapsed onto soft grass that glowed with a faint blue light, and he lay there gasping and trying to remember how to breathe properly. The forest around him looked like something from a dream, with trees made of crystal that sang in the wind and flowers that pulsed with their own inner light, and the air smelled sweet, like honey and rain. Jake pushed himself up on trembling arms and looked back at what remained of his reconnaissance ship, and it was barely recognizable as anything that had once flown through space. A shadow passed over him, and he looked up to see something impossible. A dragon circled above him, and its scales gleamed like polished emeralds in the strange sunlight, and its wings were so massive they seemed to block out half the sky. On its back sat a woman with silver hair that flowed like liquid metal, and she wore armor that looked like it had been forged from starlight itself, and her eyes burned with violet fire. The dragon landed with surprising grace, and the woman slid down from its neck and walked toward Jake with one hand on the sword at her hip. She was tall and graceful, and her ears came to elegant points, and Jake realized he was looking at an elf, and his exhausted brain tried to make sense of that. The woman stopped a few feet away and studied him with an expression that mixed anger and confusion, and something that might have been fear. Her voice was clear and cold when she finally spoke, and it carried an accent Jake had never heard before. "How did you get here? And what manner of creature are you to break through the sacred barriers that have protected this world for 3,000 years?" Jake tried to stand, but his legs gave out, and he sat back down hard and raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "My name is Jake Morrison, and I am a human pilot from the Terran Federation, and my ship was pulled from hyperspace by some kind of energy pulse, and your defense systems tore me apart before I could even send a distress signal." The woman took a step closer, and her hand tightened on her sword, and the dragon behind her growled low in its throat. "A human and a male at that, and you expect me to believe you came here by accident when no man has set foot on Etheria Prime since the Great Banishment." Jake shook his head and immediately regretted it as pain shot through his skull. "I do not know anything about a banishment, and I was tracking hostile forces when something grabbed my ship and pulled me here, and I am just trying to understand what happened." The woman circled him slowly, and her eyes never left his face, and Jake could see her mind working behind those violet eyes. "My name is Lyra Shadowmoon, and I am guardian of the northern reaches and bonded warrior to Emerald Wing, who you see behind me, and according to our laws your presence here is forbidden and the penalty is death." Jake felt his blood run cold, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. "Then why have you not killed me already?" Lyra stopped pacing and looked at the wreckage of his ship, and something in her expression changed. "Because there is something wrong here, and the barriers should have destroyed you completely before you ever reached the surface, and yet here you are and your ship carries markings I have seen before in the Forbidden Archives." She knelt down next to a piece of twisted hull and ran her fingers over symbols etched into the metal, and her face went pale. "These symbols match the ancient weapons that nearly destroyed our world 3,000 years ago, and they match the technology we sealed away and swore never to use again." Jake pulled himself closer and looked at the markings, and recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Those are convergence markings, and they are a biomechanical hive mind that assimilates entire civilizations, and I was hunting their scouts when I got pulled here." Lyra stood abruptly, and her hand went back to her sword. You speak in riddles, and I do not understand half of what you say." Before Jake could respond, Emerald Wing raised her massive head and roared, and the sound shook the trees around them. Lyra spun and looked at the sky, and her face hardened. Something comes, and it is not of Etheria. Prime dark shapes appeared on the horizon, moving fast and leaving trails of black smoke behind them, and they did not look like any aircraft Jake had ever seen from this world. Lyra made a decision in that instant and grabbed Jake by his flight suit and hauled him to his feet. "You will come with me now, and we will sort out truth from lies later. But if you have brought danger to my world, I will feed you to Emerald Wing myself." She whistled, and the dragon lowered its neck, and Lyra practically threw Jake onto its back before climbing up behind him. "Hold onto the saddle and do not let go, or you will fall and die." Emerald Wing launched into the air with a powerful thrust of her wings, and Jake grabbed the saddle horn and held on for his life as the ground dropped away beneath them. The dark shapes changed course and started following them, and Jake saw weapons powering up on their hulls. "Those are convergence fighters, and they must have followed my signature when I crashed." Lyra leaned forward and whispered something to Emerald Wing, and the dragon dove toward the crystal forest and wove between the massive trees with impossible precision. Energy bolts screamed past them, and one clipped a tree, and it exploded into a million glittering fragments. Emerald Wing banked hard, and Jake nearly lost his grip, but Lyra grabbed his arm and held him steady. The dragon climbed suddenly and flipped over, and Jake saw the forest spinning below him, and his stomach lurched. Emerald Wing breathed a stream of green fire that caught one of the pursuing ships, and it spiraled down, trailing flames. But there were more coming, and Jake could see larger ships dropping through the clouds. Lyra cursed in a language Jake did not know, and urged Emerald Wing higher and faster. "We fly to the Whispering Peaks, and there I have a sanctuary where we can hide and plan, and if what you say is true, then Etheria Prime faces a threat it has not seen in 3 millennia. Jake held on tight as they raced toward distant mountains, and behind them, the sky filled with enemy ships. The sanctuary sat high in the mountains, carved into living rock that glowed with soft amber light from within. Emerald Wing landed on a wide platform and folded her wings, and Lyra slid down and helped Jake, who nearly collapsed when his feet touched solid ground. A younger elf woman rushed out from the cave entrance, and her eyes went wide when she saw Jake. "Lyra, what have you brought here, and is that really what I think it is?" Her name was Maya, and she was smaller than Lyra, with auburn hair instead of silver and green eyes that sparkled with curiosity instead of caution. "This is Jake Morrison, and he claims to be a human pilot who crashed after being pulled from space by an unknown force, and behind us come enemies that might threaten everything we know." Maya circled Jake like he was some exotic creature from a zoo, and she poked his shoulder as if testing whether he was real. "I have only read about humans in the old texts before the banishment, and you look different than the pictures showed." Jake managed a tired smile, despite everything I could say the same about elves, since I thought you were just myths and legends. Maya laughed, but Lyra cut her off with a sharp gesture. "There is no time for this, and we need to analyze the wreckage from his ship and determine what brought him here and what follows him." They moved inside the sanctuary, and it opened into a vast chamber filled with strange devices and glowing screens and shelves of ancient books. Maya was clearly some kind of engineer or scientist, and her workspace looked like organized chaos. Jake collapsed into a chair while Maya activated several scanning devices and projected images of his crashed ship into the air. Lyra paced like a caged cat and kept glancing toward the entrance where Emerald Wing stood guard. Jake forced himself to focus and began explaining what he knew. The Convergence is a hive mind made up of billions of assimilated beings from hundreds of worlds, and they consume civilizations by converting organic and inorganic matter into extensions of themselves, and they have been expanding through this sector for decades. Maya pulled up data from the ship fragments, and her face went pale. The energy signature from these weapons matches readings from the Cataclysm archives, and those are sealed records from 3,000 years ago when the great catastrophe occurred. Lyra stopped pacing and looked at her sister. "What are you saying?" Maya worked faster and pulled up more data, and ancient symbols appeared next to modern readouts. "I am saying that the weapons technology that nearly destroyed Etheria Prime carries the same quantum signature as these convergence devices, and the match is too precise to be coincidence." Jake sat forward despite his exhaustion. "You are telling me the convergence was here before and 3,000 years ago?" Maya nodded slowly as pieces fell into place. "Our history teaches that men brought war and destruction through their aggression and greed, and that the matriarchs banished all males to save our world, and we built the barriers to keep them out forever. But what if the real story was more complicated than that?" Lyra joined her sister at the console and studied the data explain. Maya pulled up images of ancient weapons and battlefield recordings that had been sealed for millennia. What if the convergence infiltrated Etheria Prime 3,000 years ago and manipulated both men and women into fighting each other? And what if the destruction we blamed on male aggression was actually caused by convergence technology being used by compromised individuals on both sides? Jake closed his eyes and felt sick. That is exactly what the convergence does, and they infiltrate and manipulate and turn civilizations against themselves before moving in to assimilate the survivors. Lyra slammed her fist on the table. "So our entire history is a lie, and we banished half our population based on convergence manipulation." "Not entirely a lie," said Maya, "but simplified and shaped to fit a narrative that kept us safe in isolation, and the barriers did protect us for 3,000 years. But now they have found us again," said Jake, "and they must have been searching for this world because it escaped them once. And the convergence never forgets and never stops." An alarm blared, and Maya rushed to another console. "The barrier network is showing anomalies, and there are weak points appearing in the southern hemisphere that should not exist." Jake stood on shaky legs and joined her. "How long have these weak points been developing?" Maya checked the historical logs, and her face went white. "Decades, and they have been growing slowly and deliberately, as if something has been systematically dismantling the barriers from inside." Lyra drew her sword. "We have a traitor. Someone on Etheria Prime has been working with the convergence," said Jake, "and preparing the planet for invasion." Maya worked frantically pulling up security logs and communication records. If someone has been sabotaging the barriers, they would need access to the primary control nodes, and those are only accessible by the Council of Matriarchs. Lyra and Maya looked at each other, and the same terrible realization crossed both their faces. "We need to contact the Dragon Guard," said Lyra, "and we need to warn the Council, even if one of them is the traitor." Jake grabbed her arm. "If you warn the Council, the traitor will know you are onto them and will accelerate whatever plan they have." "Then what do you suggest?" asked Lyra. "We investigate quietly," said Jake, "and we find proof before making accusations. And in the meantime, we need to prepare for what is coming, because those ships that chased us were just scouts." Maya pulled up tactical displays of Etheria Prime. "I can track the barrier degradation patterns and determine which control nodes have been compromised, and that will tell us who had access. Do it," said Lyra, "and I will contact Zara Nightwhisper, and she leads the Dragon Guard and has been my war sister since we were younglings, and I trust her with my life." Jake looked at the tactical display and saw the enemy ships gathering at the edge of the system. "You better hurry, because I estimate we have maybe 2 days before the convergence realizes the barriers are weak enough for a full invasion." Lyra moved to a communication crystal and activated it. "Zara and I need you to come to my sanctuary immediately and bring no one else, and tell no one where you are going, and this is a matter of planetary survival." A voice responded, warm but concerned. "You sound frightened, old friend, and I have never heard fear in your voice before." "That is because I have never faced anything like this before," said Lyra. Maya continued working and suddenly froze. "I found something, and the primary sabotage is coming from the council chambers themselves, and the access codes belong to Elder Cassandra Moonweaver." Lyra looked like someone had struck her. "Cassandra has served the council for 2 centuries, and she is one of our most respected leaders, which makes her the perfect agent," said Jake. "And no one would suspect her." The communication crystal flared again, and a new face appeared, and this was Zara, with short black hair and scars across her cheek. "I am incoming on Stormblade and will arrive within the hour." Lyra ended the transmission and looked at Jake and Maya. "We gather evidence, and we prepare for war, and we save our world from the mistakes of the past." Zara arrived as promised, riding a dragon with scales like storm clouds and eyes that crackled with lightning. She landed hard and slid from Stormblade with the easy grace of a warrior who had spent decades in the saddle. Lyra met her on the platform, and they embraced briefly before Zara pulled back and studied Jake with undisguised suspicion. "So this is the impossible male who broke through our sacred barriers and brought enemies to our doorstep." Jake raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I did not mean to bring danger here, but the convergence follows where I go. And they want this world for reasons that go back 3,000 years. Zara looked at Lyra for confirmation. "You believe him?" "I believe the evidence," said Lyra, "and Maya has found proof that Elder Cassandra has been sabotaging the planetary barriers for decades." "That is treason of the highest order," said Zara, and her hand went to her sword. "And if true, it means war is coming." "It is already here," said Jake, and pointed to the tactical display where more convergence ships gathered at the system edge. Maya pulled up the evidence she had compiled and showed Zara the access logs and barrier degradation patterns and energy signatures that matched the ancient cataclysm. Zara studied it all with the sharp eyes of a military commander, and her expression grew darker with each revelation. "This cannot be ignored any longer, and we must bring this before the full council." "They will not listen," said Lyra, "and they have spent 3,000 years believing their own mythology, and telling them the truth will shatter everything they know. Then we make them listen," said Zara. Before anyone could respond, alarms screamed through the sanctuary, and Maya rushed to her console. "There is an attack on the border settlement of Crystal Falls, and energy signatures match convergence weapons." "Show me," said Zara. The display shifted to show a small village nestled in a valley, and dark ships descended from above and fired beams of sickly green light. Where the beams struck, everything simply vanished, and people and buildings and trees all disappeared into nothingness. Lyra grabbed her sword and ran for Emerald Wing, but Zara caught her arm. "It is too late, and the settlement is already gone, and there is nothing left to save." The display confirmed her words as the last traces of Crystal Falls simply ceased to exist. Jake felt rage building in his chest. That is how they operate, and they do not just kill. They erase and assimilate and convert matter into more of themselves. "We must evacuate the other border settlements," said Maya. Zara shook her head. "We must go to the council now and show them this evidence and force them to mobilize the Dragon Guard." They flew to the capital city of Luminara with Emerald Wing and Stormblade, carrying them through clouds that glowed with twilight colors. The city spread below them like a jewel, with spires of crystal and flowing gardens, and streets that pulsed with gentle light. It looked peaceful and beautiful, and completely unprepared for the horror that was coming. They landed at the council chambers, and Zara used her authority as Dragon Guard commander to demand an immediate emergency session. The matriarchs gathered in a great circular hall with seats rising in tiers around a central platform. Elder Cassandra sat at the highest point, and her face was serene and ageless, and she looked at Jake with eyes that showed no surprise. The council erupted in outrage when they saw a male in their sacred chambers. Lyra stood firm and presented the evidence while Maya projected the data for all to see. Most of the matriarchs rejected it outright and refused to believe the barriers could fail, or that one of their own could betray them. Elder Cassandra listened to it all with a small smile playing at her lips. Finally, she stood and raised her hand for silence. What Lyra and her companions say has truth in it, and I have indeed been in communication with forces beyond our world. The council chamber went deathly quiet. Cassandra continued, her voice calm and reasonable. For 3,000 years we have hidden from the galaxy like frightened children, and we have stagnated while the universe evolved beyond us. The convergence offers us a chance to transcend our limitations and join with something greater than ourselves. You speak of assimilation, said Jake, and you speak of losing everything that makes you individuals. Cassandra turned her serene gaze on him. I speak of peace and unity and an end to conflict, and the convergence has shown me the truth, and together we will achieve enlightenment. Lyra stepped forward and her hand was on her sword. You betrayed our entire world for a lie. Cassandra reached into her robes and pulled out a small device. I have prepared our world for ascension, and the barriers fall as we speak. She pressed a button on the device, and throughout the city alarms began to sound. The tactical display showed the planetary barriers collapsing in cascading failures all across the globe. Zara lunged for Cassandra, but the elder matriarch moved with impossible speed, and her eyes began to glow with the same sickly green as convergence weapons. She has already been partially assimilated, said Jake. Cassandra laughed, and it sounded wrong, like multiple voices speaking at once. The process began years ago, and I have been their instrument all along, and now the harvest begins. The ceiling of the council chamber exploded inward, and convergence dropships poured through. Warriors made of twisted metal and corrupted flesh descended on cables and began firing at the panicking matriarchs. Zara grabbed 2 council members and threw them toward the exit. Dragon Guard to me, and all riders to your mounts, and defend the city. Lyra and Jake fought their way through the chaos as biomechanical soldiers advanced from all sides. Emerald Wing crashed through a wall and roared her defiance, and Lyra leaped onto her back while Jake scrambled up behind her. They burst through the shattered ceiling and into a sky filled with war. Convergence ships blanketed the city, and green fire rained down on buildings that had stood for millennia. Dragon riders rose to meet them, and the air filled with flame and screams and the sound of energy weapons. Jake held tight as Emerald Wing dove and climbed and spun, and her green fire consumed enemy fighters. But for every ship they destroyed, 2 more appeared. On the ground, Jake could see civilians being herded into collection points where convergence conversion machines waited. Some people tried to fight, but convergence soldiers were relentless, and those who resisted were simply vaporized. This is just the beginning, said Jake, and the main invasion force has not even arrived yet. Then we must slow them. Down, said Lyra, and give our people time to evacuate. Zara flew alongside them on Stormblade. I am rallying the Dragon Guard to defend the evacuation routes, and we need to buy time for Maya to activate the ancient weapons. What ancient weapons? Asked Jake. The ones we swore never to use again, said Lyra, and the ones that bear convergence signatures, because now we know why they are so effective. They are reverse-engineered from convergence technology captured during the last invasion 3,000 years ago. Jake felt a grim satisfaction. Then use them and fight fire with fire. Below them, Luminara burned. The battle raged for 3 days without pause, and the sky above Etheria Prime burned with constant fire. Maya worked frantically in the ancient weapons vault beneath the capital, and around her lay sealed containers that had not been opened. In 3 millennia, she cracked each seal, and inside were devices that hummed with deadly purpose and energy signatures that made her instruments scream warnings. These weapons had been locked away because they were too terrible to use and too dangerous to destroy. Now they were the only hope. Above ground, Lyra and Emerald Wing led squadron after squadron against the endless waves of convergence ships. The Dragon Guard fought with courage beyond measure, but they were designed to fight other dragons, not biomechanical monstrosities that felt no fear and took no prisoners. Jake coordinated from Emerald Wing back, and he used his military training to spot patterns in the convergence assault. "They are establishing hive nodes," said Jake, and pointing to massive ships that landed in the southern continent, "and those are conversion facilities where they turn captured people into drones. We must destroy them," said Lyra. "Not yet," said Jake, "and if we destroy them now, they will just build more, and we need to find their central intelligence hub and take that out first." Zara flew close with Stormblade, and her armor was scorched black from energy weapons. "We cannot hold much longer, and half the Dragon Guard is wounded or dead, and the civilians are still evacuating." "How long do they need?" asked Lyra. "At least another day," said Zara, "and maybe 2 if we are lucky." "Then we give them 2 days," said Jake, "even if it kills us." A massive explosion rocked the city, and they turned to see one of the ancient spires collapse in flames. Maya's voice crackled through communication crystals. "I have the weapons ready, but they need to be mounted on dragon armor, and that will take time. I do not have Lyra made a decision. Fall back to the workshop and we will buy you the time." She rallied the remaining Dragon Guard, and they formed a defensive perimeter around the weapons vault. The Convergence sensed the concentration of forces and redirected their assault. Wave after wave of biomechanical soldiers crashed against the dragon defenders. Emerald Wing bathed them in green fire, and her claws tore through metal and flesh with equal ease. Stormblade called down lightning that fried circuits and overloaded weapons. Other dragons used ice and acid and pure force, and the battlefield became a hell of competing elements. Jake fought from Emerald Wing back with a salvaged energy rifle, and he picked off targets that got too close to wounded riders. He saw young dragon riders no older than teenagers fighting with desperate courage. He saw old veterans with scarred armor making last stands to protect others. He saw dragons mourning their fallen riders and riders weeping over dying dragons. This was war in its purest and most terrible form. Maya emerged after what felt like an eternity, and she carried the first retrofitted armor piece. It attached to dragon chest plates and hummed with power that disrupted convergence signals. The first dragon to receive the upgrade was Emerald Wing, and when the armor activated, she roared with new strength. Her fire changed from green to brilliant white, and where it struck convergence soldiers, they did not just die, they completely shut down. The effect rippled through nearby enemy forces, and their coordinated attacks became confused and disorganized. "It works," shouted Maya, "and the weapons disrupt their hive connection." "Get those on every dragon," said Zara, "and do it now." The Dragon Guard fell back in rotating shifts to receive the upgrades while others held the line. With each dragon that received the ancient weapons, the tide began to shift. The Convergence adapted and sent heavier forces, but now the dragons could fight back effectively. Jake noticed something in the enemy patterns. "They are pulling forces from the hive nodes to attack us here, and that means the nodes are less defended." Lyra saw where he was going. "You want to attack them while they are weak?" Jake nodded. "A small strike team could penetrate the largest node and plant a virus in their central system. And I have one in my ship computer that was designed specifically to disrupt convergence networks. That is suicide," said Zara. "Probably," said Jake, "but it might also win us this war." Lyra looked at Emerald Wing, and the dragon met her gaze with understanding. "We will go," said Lyra. "I am coming too," said Maya, "and I need to interface the virus with their systems, and you cannot do that without me." Zara wanted to argue, but she knew they were right. "Then I hold the city, and you take whatever dragons you need." Lyra chose 5 other riders and their dragons, and all had received the ancient weapon upgrades. They flew low under cover of the crystal forests toward the southern continent, where the largest hive node pulsed with sickly green light. The node was massive like a mountain that breathed and pulsed, and around it converted elves worked in mindless unity, building more convergence infrastructure. Jake felt sick seeing people he might have saved now lost to the hive mind. They landed in the ruins of an old temple just outside the node perimeter and moved forward on foot. The ancient weapons helped mask their presence from convergent sensors, but they still had to fight through patrols. The converted elves fought without strategy or self-preservation, and they simply threw themselves at the attackers until they were destroyed. Jake hated every moment of it because these were victims, not enemies. They reached the node exterior, and Maya placed shaped charges on a ventilation port. The explosion was small and precise, and it opened a gap just large enough to slip through. Inside the node was a nightmare of organic and mechanical fusion, and walls pulsed like living tissue and cables writhed like tentacles. They fought their way deeper past converted workers and biomechanical guards. Jake led with his rifle, and Lyra covered their backs with her sword, and the other riders formed a protective circle around Maya. Finally, they reached the central chamber, and there, hanging in the air, was a massive brain made of crystallized thought patterns and pulsing energy. The Convergent's collective consciousness focused on them, and Jake felt its attention like a physical weight. A voice spoke inside all their heads at once. "You cannot stop the inevitable, and we are perfection and unity, and you are chaos and division." Jake stepped forward and pulled out the virus drive. "We are also unpredictable and stubborn and too dumb to know when we are beaten." He moved toward an interface port, but the consciousness lashed out with energy tendrils. Lyra cut through them with her sword, and Maya rushed forward to plug in the virus. The collective consciousness screamed inside their minds, "You offer yourself for assimilation and save your primitive civilization, or you all die here and we consume your worlds anyway." Jake met Lyra's eyes and saw the same determination reflected there. "We choose option 3 and we kick your collective teeth in." Maya activated the virus and it spread through the node systems like wildfire. The collective consciousness convulsed and the walls began to crack. "Run," shouted Jake. They sprinted back the way they came as the node collapsed around them. They burst from the collapsing node just as the entire structure began to implode. Behind them, converted elves stopped moving and stood frozen as their connection to the hive mind severed. Some collapsed and others simply stood there confused and lost. The dragons waited at their rally point, and Lyra and Jake scrambled onto Emerald Wing while Maya climbed aboard another dragon. But as they took flight, a massive energy beam lanced out from the dying node. It was meant for Jake, but Lyra saw it coming and pushed him down. The beam tore through Emerald Wing, and the dragon screamed in pain, and they spiraled out of control. They crashed hard into the ruins of an ancient temple, and Jake felt his shoulder dislocate on impact. Lyra was thrown clear, and she landed wrong, and Jake heard bones break. Emerald Wing tried to stand, but her wing was ruined, and she collapsed with a mournful cry. The other dragons circled overhead, but Convergence forces were closing in. Fast, Maya's voice came through the communicator. "We are coming back for you." "No," said Lyra through gritted teeth, "and get that virus data back to Zara and finish this fight." Jake crawled to Lyra and saw blood spreading across her armor. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," she said, and her face was pale, but her eyes were still fierce. Jake tried to lift her, but she cried out in pain. "We need to move," said Jake, "and they will be here any moment." A soft voice spoke from deeper in the temple ruins. "Then perhaps you should come inside." Maya appeared in the temple doorway, and behind her the walls glowed with ancient symbols. "This temple is older than the elven civilization," said Maya, "and I think it might be the key to everything." Jake and Maya carefully carried Lyra inside, while Emerald Wing limped after them, protecting their retreat. The temple interior was vast and covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change as they looked at them. At the center stood a platform with 2 handprints carved into stone. Maya studied the symbols with wide eyes. "This is a genetic lock, and it requires DNA from both human and elf to activate." "What does it activate?" asked Jake. Maya pointed to technical readouts she was getting from her scanner. A planetary defense system that predates everything we know, and it was built by the original inhabitants of Etheria Prime. Lyra struggled to sit up. What original inhabitants and elves have been here since time began? Not according to this, said Maya, and these symbols tell a different story, and they show humans and elves living together thousands of years before the cataclysm. Jake felt the pieces falling into place. The Convergence did not just manipulate your people 3,000 years ago, and they tried to take this world before that, and the original mixed civilization must have fought them off. But something happened, said Maya, and the civilization collapsed, and the survivors split into isolated groups, and over time, the truth became myth, and myth became legend. And the Convergence has been searching for this world ever since, said Lyra, because it is the one that got away. Outside the temple, the sounds of approaching Convergence forces grew louder. We do not have much time, said Jake. Lyra tried to stand, but her legs would not support her. Then you must activate it without me. Jake shook his head. It needs both of us, and the genetic lock requires living DNA. Maya helped Lyra to the platform, and Jake supported her other side. Together they placed their hands on the ancient prince. The temple exploded with light, and power and energy flowed through them both. Jake felt the system reading their DNA and verifying their genetic markers. Deep below the temple, ancient machinery awakened for the first time in tens of thousands of years. The planetary defense system activated and sent a harmonic pulse across the entire world. The pulse was keyed to the specific quantum signature of Convergence technology. Where it passed, Convergence ships simply stopped functioning and fell from the sky. Biomechanical soldiers collapsed and their circuits fried. The hive nodes went silent and the conversion processes reversed. Across Etheria Prime converted, elves began to wake from their nightmare. The Convergence fleet in orbit tried to retreat, but the pulse reached them too, and they went dark. Jake and Lyra collapsed together and the energy release left them both drained. Maya was already sending signals to Zara. The Convergence is defeated, and send medical teams to these coordinates. Emerald Wing crawled to Lyra and laid her massive head next to her rider. The dragon was healing slowly, and the ancient weapons in her armor helping regenerate her damaged wing. Zara arrived with the remaining dragon guard, and medical teams rushed to help the wounded. The battle was over. In the days that followed the truth about Etheria, Prime history spread across the planet. The Council of Matriarchs faced angry questions about the lies they had built their society on. Elder Cassandra survived the Convergence purge, but she was imprisoned for her betrayal. The converted elves slowly recovered, though many bore psychological scars from their time in the hive mind. Jake's ship distress signal finally reached the Terran Federation, and a fleet arrived to find an elf world in chaos. First contact between the two civilizations was tense but hopeful. Lyra recovered in the medical ward with Emerald Wing sleeping beside her bed. Jake visited every day and they talked about the future. The old world is gone, said Lyra, and we cannot go back to isolation and ignorance. No, said Jake, but you can build something new. Lyra looked at him with those violet eyes. Will you help us? Jake thought about everything that had happened and everyone who had fought and died. The Federation will send ambassadors and aid and we can establish formal relations. That is not what I asked, said Lyra. Jake smiled. I know. Weeks later, Jake stood before the Reformed Council with Lyra at his side. She had proposed something radical, and the matriarchs were divided. A joint military academy, said one elder, and you want to invite human soldiers to train alongside our Dragon Guard. Not just soldiers, said Lyra, but scholars and engineers and civilians, and we invite them to help us rebuild and prepare for future threats. And you trust them? Asked another matriarch. I trust that we are stronger together than apart, said Lyra, and the ancient defense system proved that our peoples were meant to work as one. The council debated for hours, but eventually they voted to approve. The age of isolation, ended with that vote. Construction began on the first joint academy in the rebuilt section of Luminara. Human and elf engineers worked side by side, dragon riders and fighter pilots trained together. Maya led the technology exchange program and shared elven knowledge while learning human sciences. Zara commanded the combined defense forces with a human admiral as her second, and Jake stayed on Etheria Prime as the Federation liaison and military advisor. He stood with Lyra on a balcony overlooking the academy grounds and watched human and elf students training with their dragons. "This is just the beginning," said Lyra. Jake nodded. "The convergence is still out there and they will come back eventually, then we will be ready," said Lyra, "and this time we fight together." Emerald Wing landed beside them and her wing fully healed and stronger than before. The dragon looked at Jake with intelligent eyes, and Jake could swear she was smiling. "Are you ready for another flight?" asked Lyra. "Always," said Jake. They climbed onto Emerald Wing back, and the dragon launched into the sky. Below them, the academy grounds bustled with activity. Above them, the stars beckoned with infinite possibilities. The age of unity had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same.